Hey guys, it's Cal again, and I'm here in my VR4 Legnum, and someone just asked me a question about my UTCOMP trip computer, and I realised whilst I have 5 videos on the installation, I didn't really have many decent videos, if any, on the operation. So I thought I'd show you that right now. It's been a while since I fitted this, and the original videos I had dedicated gauges over here on the dash for boost and whatnot, and I had an oil gauge down here, but now the only gauges in this car are in the UTCOMP, so let's stop dicking around and let's get to it. So when you turn the car on, I have a little bit of Japanese there which says Reganamu, which is Legnum in Japanese. And I'm just going to turn that off, turn off the radio. What you'll see here is the default screen I have right now is, well, there's multiple screens available, but the default screen I have is air fuel ratio, which is being powered by a Innovate LC2 with no gauge, which you can buy. As you can see, it's just warmed up. I have a manifold absolute pressure sensor there on the right hand side, and looks really foggy. I'm not sure why. It's like it's blown. There we go. Let's do that. Let's leave it zoomed in. I have fuel pressure on the left, and I have oil temperature on the right. The clock buttons, which are 3 here, I can change the inputs here from oil pressure to fuel pressure, oil temperature to water temperature on this particular screen. The normal trip computer screen I've got here has clock, speed, and the speed's done by tapping into the speedo pulse wires. I have very accurate fuel consumption, and this is high because I run E85 pretty much all the time now. And this is fed by tapping into the #1 injector trigger, and then what you do is you drive around and you compare how much fuel you put in at top up compared to how much fuel the car used, and there's a calculation tool in the programming software which lets you then calculate exactly how many milliliters of fuel are delivered, for example, per injector pulse, which lets you get highly accurate fuel readings. This particular screen, I've got distance to empty, and I think that's amount of fuel left, and clock, and on the right I've got oil temperature and water temperature set. The next screen I've got just temperatures and battery voltage. So these temperatures are fed by these what they call DS1820, whatever they are, temperature sensors. One's outside under the left front wheel arch, sorry, and this one's inside the cab. It is very hot in here right now, as you can tell. I'm sweating like a pig. The next one here is when you stop driving, it tells you how long you drove for, how much fuel you used, how much that cost you, and you obviously have to tell it what the fuel price is, and I use E85, so it is literally $1.49 a litre no matter what, because the only E85 producer in Australia is United, and they can just control the price, but at least that means my price is consistent. It also tells me your average fuel consumption and the distance that you travel on that screen. The next one is fuel tank, and this is, again, highly accurate because the fuel tank size, you tell it how big the fuel tank is, and when you fill it up, you reset this gauge, and you do that by pressing this button here, and you say, update tacho, how much fuel's in the tank, or you can just fill it up. So if I do that again, update tacho, fully tanked up, yes or no, and you can say yes with and reset the stats, like this is your fuel consumption stats. When you reset it, it goes back to the top up, and the fuel consumed is based on injector pulses, which is very accurate, so you can actually have an extremely accurate fuel gauge. And so as you can see here, I have just under a full tank, half a tank of gas, and as any Legnum owner would know, the fuel gauge is highly inaccurate. That is literally what it reads for half a tank. So yeah, that's why this is actually quite handy. That's a very helpful little doodad. The next screen I have here is, I'm sorry about the blurriness here, but it really doesn't like the brightness of that screen. We've gone back to the screen here. So let's start the car. so you can see what actually happens. Now, just before I do that, I will tell you that currently my oil pressure is disconnected because I've recently installed an oil cooler and I don't have enough outputs or taps on that cooler for both oil pressure and oil temperature. So I don't have any oil pressure right now. And my fuel pressure sensor is currently plugged into my cooling system, and I'm monitoring coolant pressure. Yes, you're thinking, why? But I like data. And so these sensors, I'm going to zoom out here, they all look like this. These are like $15 on eBay. These are 0 to 150 PSI sensors. There's no reason to have a 150 PSI sensor monitoring the water, duh. But I've actually used the same model sensor, and that means I don't need to recalibrate the voltage readings for the pressure, right? So I don't have to worry about that. So I'm just using the same 0 to 150 PSI sensor for water pressure. All right, having said all that, let's start the car. And I might actually put the air conditioner on because I'm freaking hot. All right, so you won't notice any pressure in the cooling system, nor will you notice any pressure in, this is a false reading because there's no signal coming back, but if it was working, what you would see is on a cold engine, quite high oil pressures, around about 80 to 90 PSI. You can see I've got about 15.2. If I rev it, you'll see that change. You also see the vacuum change. By the way, this reads in vacuum PSI. It doesn't read in inches or millimeters of mercury, or inches of mercury, sorry, which is slightly annoying. It's made by a guy in Poland and they don't use inches over there. And I've asked him to make vacuum report in inches of mercury, but he's refused so far, or he just hasn't responded. But you can see the water temperature climbing. If I change back to, sorry, wrong button. You'll see now the water temperature, water pressure is actually climbing. So as the engine heats up, the water is expanding, it's increasing the pressure in the cooling system. And the reason I was doing that was just to monitor, I had some overheating issues. It turns out there was air in the system, but this is actually very handy because it helps to tell you if your radiator cap has failed, either open or stuck closed, so you can actually monitor that. By the way, all of these sensors, pretty much all of them, including AFR, boost pressure, fuel pressure, and oil pressure, there isn't actually a dedicated water pressure reading as it's reading fuel. I've asked the developer to add an option for water pressure, but either way, all of these can have an alert. So if the oil pressure drops, it beeps an alarm. It is quite loud. If the water temperature gets too hot, it beeps an alarm. What I don't have at the moment, and I've asked them to do it, is to measure RPM and boost. So, RPM, boost, and AFR. So, for example, what I would like to see is if the car's at high revs and the car is on boost, and if the AFRs suddenly lean the fuck out, I would like to get an alarm for that as well. Yes, this is not as good as a automatic engine safety system built into an ECU, but if you don't have that, this system is actually really good. Just flicking back to the screen here, you can see we're consuming 3.2 litres an hour. That's actually quite high, again, because this is E85 in this car. This car is flex fuel. No, I don't have a ethanol content reading on this device. I do have one in the ECU, obviously, because the ECU is flex fuel tuned. It would be nice to get that. There is a 5-volt output out of the flex fuel controller, but the UTCOMP right now does not have a ethanol reading option. You can configure one. Like I say, it doesn't do water. It doesn't do water, it does oil and fuel right now, but you can hack the ROM effectively, change the icons, upload custom icons, and you could just, it might say fuel in the programming app, but your icon might say water, and as far as you're concerned, it's water, because in the gauge on the display, there's no words. You know, you can decide what that means, right? You don't even have to change the icon if you didn't want to. But if you did, you can at least then say, look, I know what it is, right? To help you monitor that. But overall, this is very, very cool stuff. When I'm driving along, I generally, particularly if I'm on it, if I'm actually in the mountains, I'll generally be monitoring this. So I generally monitor oil temperature. So I'll generally monitor oil temperature, and often I'll actually usually be monitoring oil pressure as well. So I'll be driving along, monitoring my boost, monitoring my AFRs, looking at oil pressure, and looking at oil temperature to see how the car is going. Generally, that's what I need to monitor, because the dash gauge for water temperature is fairly reliable. If the car gets hot, it will climb, and this is the one that nothing in the car is actually monitoring, right? Your oil pressures and your AFR.